Right now, we are joined by a former special advisor to President Trump and also a senior fellow up at the Hoover Institution, Stanford. Dr. Scott Atlas joins us right now. Dr. Atlas, good to talk with you as always, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So I know that you were involved in the White House in an advisory capacity for the pandemic. I know that you know all the ins and outs of Operation Warp Speed and the miracle that it is in terms of getting the virus on board. So when I saw Dr. Fauci over the weekend really taking credit, saying, "Oh, this virus is the best, the vaccine is the best decision I've ever made," I thought of you immediately. You know these people. But could you please lend a little bit of context to Dr. Fauci taking credit for the vaccine?
Well, I mean, the vaccine development was first initiated by the president's realization that he was going to do what turned out to be a very smart thing, which was take the risk away from the companies developing the vaccines and just paying for millions, hundreds of millions of doses and development and production in advance of them even having the vaccine developed. And that was a smart gamble. But then after that, the point of the development and vaccine distribution and everything was done by other people. Dr. Slawi was in charge of the vaccine development program. General Perna and FEMA and other people were in charge of logistics and distribution planning. Alex Azar, the Secretary of HHS, and his team were overall in charge of Operation Warp Speed. And the name that you mentioned earlier is missing from the list of people that were involved in the vaccine.
Yeah, that would be Dr. Anthony Fauci. And again, I just want to quote him. When I saw what happened in New York City, almost overrunning our healthcare system, that's when it became very clear that the decision we made on January 10th to go all out and develop a vaccine may have been the best decision that I've ever made with regard to intervention as the director of the Institute. From your firsthand knowledge of this situation, Dr. Fauci, this was not his decision. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, for him to claim credit for that is sort of unconscionable.
Yeah. So what do you think's at play here? Because you've got that statement. You also saw he and Dr. Birx, along with several other doctors that were involved in the Trump team, they're featured on CNN. By the way, I noticed you weren't there. Did they invite you to be a part of that conversation about your firsthand experience as a doctor on the COVID-19 task force under President Trump?
No, but they did ask for comments, which I chose not to give because there's no point in giving comments to people who are going to lie and distort about what you said. So no point.
No, I think that's probably a wise decision, and it gives them some level of cover. But certainly you should have been able to participate in this roundtable discussion. But it sure seemed like they had a whole lot of criticism about the people that they were working with in the White House that they never voiced when they actually had some level of influence and could have made a difference if they really had those problems.
Well, it's more than that. It's really a complete false story that they're trying to perpetrate to the public. Dr. Birx, Dr. Fauci, the other people, their recommendations were to do the lockdowns, the curfews, the significant restrictions on freedom, the school closures, all of these things. And those recommendations were then implemented all over the country, with some rare exceptions of a couple of states like Florida or South Dakota. Mm-hmm. Their recommendations were followed by the governors who did the implementation. So I have no idea what they're lying, basically. They're trying to distance themselves from responsibility. This is obvious. They're trying to distance themselves from the accountability, as if someone who complained or criticized the policies that they recommended were to blame for the implementation of the policies that they recommended. Right. In other words, it's just like Alice in Wonderland here, except it's worse because it's really just despicable people lying and trying to distort history. They're rewriting history. The reality is Dr. Birx was the task force coordinator. Her recommendations were being given to the governors. Her recommendations, Dr. Fauci's recommendations, they're all over the media giving the recommendations. We know what they said, and what they said was done. And so this is the historical fact, and no matter what they say to change that, I'm sorry, but the truth matters.
And you mentioned Florida here as being one of the outliers with regard to not, taking as gospel and not taking this directive from Dr. Birx and the team with regard to lockdowns. They did go a different direction. And, I mean, the data is in, is it not, as we look at how Florida performed? And it's certainly not COVID-free in Florida in any stretch of the imagination, but it's also not this horrible disaster. They're pretty much right in the middle of things with regard to the spread of the virus and with regard to the net deaths on a per capita basis, as well as the totality of it. Meanwhile, their economy has been thriving.
Well, this is the point, is that somehow there should be no mistake here. The burden of saying you did something good is on the people who did these impositions of unprecedented restrictions on individuals, closing medical care, closing schools, all these things. If they cannot prove that they did something better than the people who governed in a more sensible way, they failed. Okay, those policies failed. Florida, for instance, they opened their schools. All Florida schools, 100%, are open in person and have been so for months. There are still options for parents to say they want to do distance education. But in terms of the policy, it's open. There's no mask mandates in Florida. The businesses are not closed like the people who recommended the lockdowns. And it turns out not only did Florida do just as well, they actually did better. If you look at the excess mortality rate increase, in other words, the deaths over and above what would have been predicted without the pandemic, and the percentage increase, Florida did better than two-thirds of the states. And the states that they did better than all did the lockdowns. And so, I mean, it's not that Florida had to do better. Florida wasn't as destructive as these other states were, and we know that from both their economy as well as the way people are living. But they happen to also have done even better. So this is like insane to then insist on doing lockdowns. We're in a cycle of lockdowns. We even see it now in Europe. Mm-hmm. This is, again, the world is just, we are living in a world now, it seems, where facts do not matter. Because we sit there and keep doing, we have people who keep pushing for more and more lockdowns, more and more mandates, but they don't work and they're destructive. And yet, instead of admitting they don't work and they're destructive, they keep pushing those same, policies. It's extraordinary here, and I don't know really how this is going to end. I just don't see how people are even accepting this at this point.
Dr. Atlas, is this a condition of it? Since you come from the private sector, but you also spent several months within the Trump administration and sort of being in the room as these policy decisions were being made, and certainly I think you have a wealth of knowledge when it comes to public health policies. Is this that dangerous phenomenon of elected officials seeing a problem and deciding, well, we have to do something? And even when people stand up and say, well, okay, but that thing we've been doing, these lockdowns, really doesn't make a difference at all. In fact, and there are also devastating impacts on people, health as well as economic and so on and so forth, that you're not taking into account if you do this something. But because there's no alternative, somebody needs to be able to come into the room and say, hold on, I know you want to do something. Here's what you should do instead. I mean, what is that alternative route that they should be following?
They should have done what we said from the beginning, if that's what you're asking me, which some of us said, which was take the resources that we have and increase them, in fact, and do everything we can to protect the people who we know to be at high risk. And those people were known from the beginning. This is not new knowledge. It was nothing that had to be discovered. And these are the elderly people and people with these certain significant underlying diseases. And the idea was protect those people and don't lock down and destroy other people, restrict medical care. People that had serious diseases. We have a massive public health crisis because of the lockdown in the world. I'm sorry to divert here, but 400,000 new deaths from tuberculosis this year in the world because of diversion of medical resources. 130 million new people in abject starvation-level poverty in the world because of the diversion of lockdown resources and blockage of international economic development. We had half the people in the United States almost that had chemotherapy, skipped their chemotherapy for cancer. We missed something like up to 78% of cancers that would newly be diagnosed because they didn't come in for their screening. So, in the United States alone.
No,
we have 1 out of 4 people 18 to 24 years old that thought of killing themselves. We had 300% increase in teenage medical visits from teenagers to doctors for self-harm. Okay, this is massively destructive policy. It's not just the question isn't even did it work or not. The question is, what are we doing here? We're killing people, destroying people, particularly the low-income people. And, while the rich guys and the affluent people sit at home and work from their computer and, it's inconvenient, as Dr. Fauci said. It may be inconvenient, he said, to do the lockdown.
Yeah, as he continues.
So, the targeted protection of high-risk people, and meantime, ironically, but no one talks about it, this lockdown policy failed to protect the elderly. Okay? I don't know why this isn't talked about. So, we have these people recommend this bizarre, unprecedented, harmful, destructive policy. People accepted it out of fear in the beginning. I understand that, but at some point you have to wake up. And so being afraid is not an excuse at this point in my mind. And you have these people who are trying to then run away from their responsibility. You have to realize I didn't even get to Washington until August. Birx, Fauci, and the rest of them were sitting there. Not only did their policies get implemented for the first 6 to 8 months without anyone even saying otherwise inside the White House, but even after I said it, their policies were still implemented. Their policies were implemented during the entire pandemic, for the entire year. I don't care what they want to pretend otherwise. That's what happened. If they think that the policies killed hundreds of thousands of people and were a failure, then they failed. Then they killed hundreds of thousands of people. There's no way around that.
There isn't, and clearly they're trying to rewrite history to sort of, in some way, get some sort of absolution from obviously their decisions being carried out and implemented and the results of it. Looking forward, though, listen, we got to learn from this so we don't repeat it. You just said it's no longer acceptable to be able to make these decisions and claim you're just doing it out of fear. Just this week, we had our current head of the CDC, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, say that she was, these are her words, scared and she felt impending doom about where we're headed. From a public policy standpoint, and also just based on where the numbers and data are, is that kind of language helpful, number one, and even justified?
The person should be fired immediately for saying something like that. That is completely unprofessional and honestly unacceptable for a leader of public policy to say something like that. I don't even know how to express. I've had people from all over the world, world-renowned medical scientists in infectious disease and in public policy, contact me and say, what is going on in the United States? This kind of talk disqualifies someone from being in a position of leadership, in my view, completely and totally.
Finally here, Dr. House, and I so appreciate you joining us on a regular basis here because it's truly, we are smarter at the end of the conversation. I always say that when I'm done talking to you because that's what I hope to achieve in every interview is we've learned something at the end of it. I'd love for you to comment on the state of Wisconsin. The Supreme Court just struck down a statewide mask mandate, and of course, we're getting hysterical responses about this. It's like, well, if you don't have a state mandate to wear masks, that just means we're going to have another, spread of the virus, and it's going to be devastating. At this point, your impression of the masks and how it's been implemented and the effectiveness of a mandate, the whole thing. There's one thing to think that it's good to wear a mask. There's a second when the government now says you must wear a mask.
There's two separate issues. One is the issue of the masks themselves, and another is the issue of the power of the government. If you just want to talk about the masks themselves, the mask mandates do not work. That's not even necessarily saying that masks don't work, but we know places that have mask mandates did not have an impact There is no scientific evidence that mask mandates have stopped the spread of the disease. In fact, they did not, empirically. This is not an opinion. It's factual. It's inarguable. Second point is when we see what's going on now, people are worried that cases are coming up in certain parts of the United States. And so the response of these same people is, therefore, the states like Texas or Florida, they should never have said don't have a mask mandate. Why did we not make the obvious observation here that the cases are exploding in places with the mask mandates? Right. They are not exploding in Texas and in Florida like they are in places with the mask mandates, like Michigan, for instance, or New York, New Jersey have higher increases in cases right now than the places that said we don't have a mask mandate. I don't understand the disconnect between fact here. There's some denial of fact going on. So the second part of the question is, does the government have the right to have a mask mandate? By the way, we have to remember, the Wisconsin people, they're not saying you are mandated to not wear a mask. Right. Okay, everyone who wants to wear a mask should wear a mask. Everyone who wants to wear 6 masks should wear 6 masks. If you don't want to ever leave your room again, then don't go. Don't leave. Don't go into a restaurant. Never get on an airplane. Never walk outside your door. But that does not mean that it's acceptable to have the mandates to restrict everyone from doing so.
Well said, Dr. Scott Atlas, again, a former member of the Trump administration's COVID task force and advisor to the president, and also a really important thinker at the Hoover Institution. Dr. Atlas, again, thank you for joining us, and we'll touch base again soon.